Alright guys, it is 5 o'clock and my music has stopped. Let's refresh that. Alright, there we go. It's 5 o'clock. Let's get started. Welcome. Thank you guys for showing up today. This is the second time I've done this show now. First episode we did 2 weeks ago was Ultimate. And today marks what I would call the first real episode of the show. We sorted out some of the audio issues we had last week on our inaugural episode, and I think we're at a much better spot right now. We sacrificed a little bit of mic quality to make it work, but this is what we got going on today. But welcome, guys. Today's show topic is going to be the evolution of tanking. We're going to be starting out with a bit of a history lesson, looking back at how tanking was born in beta and how it's changed, not only in the specific changes to classes that Square Enix has made, but also how players' approach and mindset towards tanking has changed. So I definitely want to make that a primary focus of today's show. But it should be a lot of fun. This is something I could talk about for hours, honestly. I've got some show notes written down here that I will hopefully stay on track with to sort of keep it maybe around a little bit over an hour or around the hour mark today. But it should be a lot of fun. I'm going to try to make today's show interesting for people who maybe you don't play tanks in Final Fantasy, but maybe you just kind of interested in what goes on in tanking, or just sort of the mindset behind it, or maybe you're a healer and you want to hear the other side of the argument. So I'm going to try to make it enjoyable for not just the tanking demographic, but the people outside the tanking demographic as well. But yep, let's get started. We're 2 minutes after 5. I want to start today. The only way we can really approach this topic is by starting with a bit of a history lesson. We got to go all the way back to, I think most of my shows actually start with a history lesson, it feels like. We want to go back to sort of the beginning of A Realm Reborn and specifically the beta, because we got to go back to the beginning to see just how different the landscape is versus now. And this will be a fun little journey, so journey with me. Back in the beta, and this will be a nice little time to sort of give some of my experience with tanking in Final Fantasy and why I feel like I'm able to talk about some of this stuff today. I started tanking actually back in the beta, and the very first class that I fell in love with was Gladiator. And the reasoning, I've told this story a couple times on my stream before, but the reasoning that I fell in love with it so much is quite hilarious, actually. I was tanking Ifrit, the story mode Ifrit, in the beta of the game, and I remember cross-classing Cure and feeling like I have so much control over this encounter. I control where the boss goes, I control the amount of damage I take, and I can heal myself in the party. Tanking is the best thing in the world. And unfortunately, to my dismay, as the game launched and we actually got into some of the later encounters in the game, you get to the later levels of the game, you start to realize those cures aren't really doing anything. So that being said, it's still, to everyone who got into tanking in the beta, most people got into it because we liked the fact that we had control over positioning of the boss, and we controlled a lot of the pacing of the fight. That's most people I talk to who tank in this game. That's what really got them into it. The fact that you're sort of the pace and tempo controller for an encounter, and that's definitely what got me. That's definitely what got me to stick with it. Even though I realized that I wasn't going to be able to be an off healer, at least at the beginning of the game, and maybe we'll get into some of that later. But moving from the beta into retail, we're entering A Realm Reborn launch, and let's think about how tanking started. hilariously enough, tanking was how should I put this? So the game launched with 2 tank jobs, right? And those were obviously there was Paladin and Warrior. However, when it came to actual tanking, it really only launched with 1 tank. So Warrior launched with the way that Warrior launched, it lacked a lot of defensive mitigation, to the point where you weren't even really much of a tank. You were kind of just a really weak DPS. And this is I'm somebody who, you know, historically played Warrior for years. But during the launch of the game in 2.0, I was a Paladin, and that reason was because I felt much more in control of my defensive capabilities as a Paladin than I did a Warrior back then. If you look back at how the game was played back then, that was definitely how the majority felt. You know, Square Enix tried to approach Warrior in 2.0 with this self-healing class kit that was a reactionary kit in its defensive capabilities, in a game that you weren't really playing reactionary. You were playing preemptively. Because of the nature of tank busters in Final Fantasy, your defensive capabilities are there to prevent you from being one-shot. That's what tanking really boiled down to at the time. So this notion of, oh, I took a tank buster with very little defensives, but then I can heal myself back up. It didn't really have much strength when you compared it to something like a Paladin that could stack Rampart and Sentinel, and oh, by the way, had a hollowed ground. Holmgang was not a thing back then. I believe it existed in 2.0 as it still existed as the pole. Oh, I actually can't recall. But it didn't have the invulnerability aspect to it at the launch, if I remember correctly. Yeah, I'm gonna go with that. I'm pretty confident that Hallowed was the only invuln back at launch. I probably should have looked that up before the show, but I'm pretty sure that's accurate. So that's 2.0, but that's not all of Realm Reborn. As people finished up their Twintania progression and 2.1 was approaching, there was a lot of feedback about Warrior, and as such, we got a word that Warrior was going to undergo some huge changes in 4.1, or rather 2.1. And what we saw was Warrior actually turn into a real tank in 2.1. So we finally have a game that is launched with more than one real tank. And now we're able to, not hinder LB generation by actually bringing two different classes. The LB generation part of it being based on class stacking. The fact that we felt it necessary to, and many others felt it necessary to bring 2 of the same tank, just tells you the shape that Warrior was in and the lack of shape that it was in back at launch. So 2.1 rolls around, we actually have 2 real tanks, and I feel like the tanking game finally starts to show itself in the game. This is where we're sort of going to begin our discussion today, with the introduction of second coil, because I think that that's where really any meaningful discussions should be started. Binding coil and anything predating that was just a series of trial and errors by Square Enix to sort of figure out how to jumpstart their game again. So let's get right into it with 2.1. 2.1 or 2.2 rather. 2.2 is the introduction of second coil, and we have now a situation where you have 2 different sets of toolkits in your party when it comes to tanking. At this point, we didn't have Astrologian, we only had Scholar and White Mage, and I think it's going to be really important to sort of talk about the healer relationship with tanks. Also, real quick, I should have mentioned this before we get started. I apologize. I want to remind you guys that when I do my podcasts, I love to have them be a forum for discussion. So I'm going to be trying to follow along with the chat as much as I can while we're talking. And if you guys want to contribute, please do. It really helps me actually keep the keep the episode and keep the topics in line with what you guys want to hear as well. So I'm going to try to be following along in chat. So I also have Moobot linking out a question form that you guys can put questions on that I'm going to look at towards the end of the show. So if you have any questions, the only requirement to those are that they somewhat be tanking related, because today's show is going to be primarily tank focused. And to kick that off, someone in chat saying, wasn't the LB generation penalties only in Heavensward and late Realm Reborn? It's possible my memory is incorrect. As I recall, they were a part of the beginning, but it's possible that I may be incorrect in that. So we'll leave it at that. But we're looking at 2.2 now. Second coil has just come out, and let's analyze what the tanking game looked like back then. Because 2.2 was a really fun patch to actually think about. It's in the rearview mirror for a lot of people. But there's a lot that actually changed in 2.2. Not even just the class changes that happened after binding coil, but just in the way tanking started to evolve. So 2.2 in second coil had a specific fight that really started to elevate the tanking game and sort of change how people's perception and playstyles of tanking were occurring. And the specific fight I'm talking about is Avatar, Turn 8. Turn 8 was sort of the game's first real low item level DPS check, I would say. DPS wall, I shouldn't say DPS check, but a DPS wall. It really forced you to have to maximize the amount of damage you were doing in that week 1 period. What ends up happening here is, at this time you're running Paladin and Warrior because those are the only two options available to you, and the dynamic of your Paladin Warrior at this time was typically that the Warrior was going to be in the off-tank role and the Paladin was going to be in the main tank role. Now this is very early 2.2, guys, I want to preface. I know that people who are really experienced with tanking are cringing at what I just said, but bear with me for a few minutes and you'll understand why I'm talking about it the way I am. The Warrior sort of started out as the off-tank, and the Paladin was viewed as the main tank. And this was typically just because of how Shield Oath was viewed. And it wasn't until later that we sort of deviated from this, and we'll get into that. Avatar forced, unless you were running a single tank comp, which you could single tank Avatar, and many groups did. If you were looking at it from a 2-tank party composition, the way you progressed through Avatar at low item levels was your tank wore a lot, your off tank specifically wore a lot of slaying gear. And this was to basically meet a DPS check that was very tight, and tighter than most things before second coil. So this was the first time where your tank DPS was really stressed. You know, even Melusine, which was a very difficult encounter in week 1 of second coil, tanks were sitting in tank stance while off tanking because the whole point to Melusine was you just wanted to survive the mechanics and just do the mechanics properly. Your DPS actually didn't matter, and sometimes your DPS was actually a hindrance in Melusine. And Rafflesia sort of behaved the same way. Percentage phase pushing, because of the nature of that, and that was very prevalent back in the day. A lot of times your tank could actually sacrifice globals and sacrifice DPS, and just focus on their role as a tank and focus on defensives, and actually not negatively impact the fight at all, just because of sometimes you're holding DPS anyway. But Avatar, that was we had a shift from that. We were strictly looking DPS, so the off tanks, which was back then really just somebody who was tanking much less than the other guy, they were wearing a lot of strength for this encounter. And if you didn't play in Realm Reborn, you didn't play Heavensward, this may be kind of foreign to you because, if you didn't play Realm Reborn, you didn't play Heavensward, and you only played Stormblood, this may be a bit foreign to you because in Stormblood we don't really have this system where tanks can wear slaying and strength gear to raise their DPS. Back and then, a tank's attack power was entirely based off of strength. It had no interaction with vitality or fending whatsoever. Fending right side, I should say. And this sort of introduced what later became called like the strength meta. And what happened in this dynamic, to give you guys some background, was tanks were having to choose between lowering their HP to do more damage or raising their HP at the cost of personal damage. And this, to me, is where we started to see a separation in playstyles. Second Coil Savage did not have any DPS checks that were so incredibly difficult that you had to play this way, but it definitely took pressure off the rest of your team if your tanks could be dealing damage. And there were definitely double full fending tanks that cleared Avatar. Not week one. Week one was actually, I think, only cleared by Triple Monk, and I don't think it was a single tank, but I think it was Triple Monk. But they definitely made up for the lack of tank DPS. And I think the first real time where we started seeing the full slaying thing become popular was Nail progression, and I'll get into why that was. It was almost sort of handed to us on a platter by Square Enix, saying, "Look, you're a tank. We know you don't have another job you can probably play. Most people don't have all their classes leveled back then. We have given you an encounter in Nail that was, for all intents and purposes, pretty much solo tankable." And players clued into this, and the players who didn't just sort of single take the fight, because there was one portion of the fight where you wanted a second tank, and that was the golem phase. It made the golem phase a lot easier because you have that second tanking there just for that one phase of the fight. The rest of the fight was kind of single tanked, and the off tank, quote unquote, just went full slaying. That was a very popular strategy in Nail progression, and it sort of started to popularize the fact that, hey, when tanks put on strength gear, we can actually do quite a bit of damage. People are referencing Xeno in the chat. Xeno back then was a huge preacher of strength and slaying. I think more so at Heavensward and later stages of Realm Reborn. That's when I remember seeing Xeno pop up, particularly in FCOB was when I think his philosophies sort of started to become more well known. But this 2.2 is really the birth of what we now call like the strength meta, and it's a really cool dynamic. Let's think about it. So how did it actually play out? Well, I think that one of the most frequently asked questions I used to get back then, because I was this is when Final Fantasy was just sort of slowly migrating into Twitter. It's very popular on Twitter now, but back then it wasn't really. But one of the most frequently asked questions on Twitter back then, not only to me but to other tanks, were, how do we know how much slaying to wear as a tank? At what point are you a liability? And I'm going to walk us through sort of the mindset and approach toward the strength meta back in a Realm Reborn lens. What went down in the decision making was, at least I'll speak for myself. I'll use myself as an example. The way I approached it was, during progression, I would pull a boss in full fending. We would do a pull. We would get as far as we can. Hopefully, we see a new mechanic, or while we're trying to get to a new mechanic, I'm testing something out along the way, maybe taking away a cooldown or adding a cooldown there, and finding some of the things I can get away with and some of the things I can't get away with. After that pull of full fending, you have a dialogue with your healers. You ask them, so how did that go? How did that feel? Did you feel like there was a lot of wasted globals from you? Did you feel like I can maybe get a little bit with a little bit more aggression? And you have this dialogue, and the reason why I think the healing, I want to have a healing portion of today's discussion. Tanking was really never just a singular role. It was always like a co-partnership with your healers. And I mean, it sounds very obvious when you say that loud, but I really mean it. Like, the decisions you have to make as a tank back then and now are decisions that you really should not be making by yourself. They're decisions that both you and your healers, and to a lesser extent your DPS, should all be making. because what you do as a tank affects what happens to your party. It affects what happens to your healers, and it affects what happens to your DPS. So it should never just be a singular decision. It should be something that you discuss with your partners. And you have this dialogue with your healers about, okay, well, this area of the fight, I really didn't feel any threatening damage. Do you feel that way? Your white mage may say, yeah, that was really nothing. Let's add it. Let's see what we can get away with. So what I'll start doing, and what I started doing back then, is after a few pulls, I'll take off a piece of bending, and we'll put on a piece of slaying, and then I'll again have a conversation with my healers. How did that feel? Was that still easy? Was it stressful? And you start playing this sort of balancing act until after a pull and after enough fending is removed, where you're talking with the healer and your healer says, this tank buster here at this area of the fight was a little much. This cost me a lot here. And at this point, that's kind of where you stop. Because what a tank's role was, and this was more prominent back then, but it still should be highlighted. What a tank's role was is you're there to support your team. Back then, and this is a great segue into my next topic, but back then, tank damage was really secondary to everything else. You're there to, your impact on your raid's DPS as a tank back then is not nearly as high as it is, say, today in Stormblood, and maybe in the later stages of Heavensward, I should say. And the fact that you're there to support your team, you don't want to be putting your healers in a position where you're costing them. Well, not only are you stressing them out, because stressing somebody out in the middle of a fight is never good. You don't want to stress your healers out, and you also don't want to be causing them to play recklessly and spend resources they don't necessarily need to. So I said this was a great segue, and I definitely want to talk about this before we leave the Realm Reborn lens of things, because this is super important. Why is it that tank stance was more prominent in Realm Reborn, and why was it that fending gear was more prominent in Realm Reborn, other than the obvious players just weren't as knowledgeable or concerned with their damage back then? Maybe the encounters didn't call for it as much. Maybe the DPS checks weren't as tight. It goes a little bit deeper than that. All of those are factors, don't get me wrong. But it goes a little bit deeper than that. The trade-off you gained from not being in tank stance back then was less than ideal compared to what we gained in Heavensward and beyond. Funnily enough, and you wouldn't expect this, but and I did say the people who were cringing earlier at my comments about the warrior being the off tank, they would get their moment. This is where I'll bring you guys back from the edge. The paladin in the quote unquote off tank role was actually the higher raid DPS variant, because of the fact that Sword Oath was so much more powerful than a defianceless warrior. The funny thing about warrior back then in Realm Reborn post 2.1 was Defiance was actually part of your max DPS rotation. If you look at what a warrior is without Defiance, you're not gaining any stacks. You're not doing any IB. Spellcleave doesn't exist yet. You're a Butcher's Block, Storm's Eye, Fracture, rotation bot. That's all you are. And every so often you have a Berserk that comes up that makes that Fracture really powerful. That's it. Compare that with Sword Oath. Sword Oath has, the extra potency on their auto attacks, and it has access to a fighter flight that isn't being nerfed by Shield Oath. Defiance had Unchained. Paladins didn't have anything even close to Unchained. So what ends up happening is as players become better throughout Realm Reborn, the Paladin actually starts to take on the more off-tank role, and the warrior starts to become more prominently the main tank. I hate using the words off-tank and main tank, because I'm a firm believer in there should be no separation between the two. There is person who's tanking the boss at this time and person who's not tanking the boss at this time. But just to make the dialogue a little bit easier today, I will kind of use off-tank and main tank a bit more frequently. So off, just when I talk about off tank, it's really just talking about somebody who's not tanking the boss. Just keep that in mind. Paladin also had cover. Cover was really powerful and just a strong tool to use as an off tank. And you just sort of had to shift like after second coil prog, and as we're approaching final coil, and definitely throughout final coil, where the paladin sort of started to become more of the off tank, and the warrior became more of the main tank. And as that happened, and as we started to progress to final coil, or up to final coil rather, the warriors who were in full slaying, who are now shifting into that main tank role, they're kind of still wearing some of that slaying. And the paladins who are shifting to more of the off tank role, they're going the way of the 2.2 warrior and putting on all slaying. So now you have kind of both of your tanks experimenting with slaying. And this definitely sets us up for final coil. And what happened in final coil was, and this is a great time for tanks. What happened in final coil was we had powerful crafted accessories release, and the melding system, which was very different than what we're used to now in Stormblood. The melding system back then, you could just go hog wild with vitality melts. And what you would do is you would wear the tanks that really started to care about their damage, is you would wear slaying crafted accessories and meld vitality onto it, so you were kind of getting a nice balance of both worlds. And well, you were really getting a strong amount of damage, but you're getting also at least some vitality to help deal with the fact. And again, you start you know, when you're pulling the boss, you're pulling in full fending, and then you're sort of taking a piece off, pull after pull, putting that crafted gear on. And the crafted gear was lower item level, so you were sacrificing a bit of strength to do that, but the efficiency it gave you was just, it was so powerful. We saw this trend continue in the Heavensward. So yeah, that really sets the stage for the entry into Heavensward. Heavensward is going to be a huge topic today, and not just the obvious of the changes to the tanks, but how the tanking dynamic changed when you're adding a third tank to the equation. And that's definitely something we want to spend a lot of time on today. I think that as we were leaving final coil, most people in farm, like as your item level, the other side of this is, as your item level increased, your need for fending decreased, and as your item level increased, your need for your healers to actually care about spending globals on you decreased. So as we were, in this item levels and farming FCOB, tanks were all full slaying. If you weren't full slaying, you were just kind of being lazy, in my opinion. There was really, if you were full fending, there was like almost no need to even use defensive cooldowns back then. At the max item level, I should say. And speaking of cooldowns, before we get into Heavensward, this is definitely something we should discuss. And I'm going to try not to relate it to Stormblood yet, but we talked a little bit about the off-tank versus main-tank relationship, but we haven't really even talked about one of probably the most important things back then, which was the idea of a tank swap. When was a tank swap a good idea? When was it beneficial? And I will tease you guys that it's going to be very different than how it is today. And this is definitely one of the reasons I want to do the show today, is sort of talk about how different it is actually in Stormblood. And tank swaps back then, we didn't have Shirk. So if you didn't play back then, Shirk is new to Stormblood. Think about how that plays out. Let's put yourselves in the shoes of a 2.4 paladin. Tank swapping back then was also okay. Let me actually go backwards even one more patch, because we didn't. Let's not even bring in ninjas to the equation yet. Put yourselves in the shoes of a 2.3 paladin. You don't have Shadewalkers. You don't have Smokescreen. There's no Ninja's not in the game yet, guys. Ninja came out in 2.4. In order to really establish your threat lead and be able to fight off that warrior who's eventually going to be doing Berserked Butcher's blocks, ideally, and you're going to be looking at, not only for that, but also for safety reasons, you're going to be looking at a shield of Provoke. And the only really answer a paladin has to that, a warrior dealing Butcher's block in the off-tank role, is that Shield Oath Talon combo. Unless you're doing a Sword of Talon, which while viable, did sort of relegate your warrior unable to incorporate any butcher's blocks into his rotation for a long time. Your threat was going to be really bad without shield up. So the concept, the mindset and approach toward tank swaps back in Realm Reborn was, the more tank swaps you have, the more you're hindering your potential DPS. In a speed kill setting, you're not going to see shield up provokes. In a speed kill setting back then, you're actually going to see off-tank warriors avoiding Butcher's Block and incorporating more Storm's Eye spam into their rotation and putting Storm's Path sparingly. You even have, in non-speed kill settings, you have the progression off-tank that's just sort of rotating Eye and Path, because the duration of Path was much less back in Realm Reborn than it was in Heavensward. It got buffed later in Heavensward. But you're rotating Eye and Path only as that off-tank warrior, so you're kind of avoiding the issue that Warrior ran into with Butcher's Block spam. But when you're in a speed kill setting, you want to avoid as much tank swapping as you can, because when you tank swap, you have to do threat combos, and threat combos, unless you were a paladin in who only had Halone, tank swaps that had a paladin forced to go shield up were DPS loss. Tank swaps that had a warrior forced to go Defiance that didn't have Unchained were DPS loss. So clearly the ball is more in the paladin's court for it being an issue. The warrior was quite a bit flexible and could tank swap more, but the general preface was you wanted to avoid tank swapping to a point. And what is that point? That point back then, what is the point if paladin reaches where they take the boss off of a warrior? That point was the warrior no longer has vengeance and the warrior no longer has home gain. At this point, your warrior is nothing more than a high armor foresight. We didn't have raw intuition. You were trying to avoid Defiance, but sometimes because of the fact that you didn't want to tank swap as much to just sort of dodge any potential threat issues that the paladin might bring into the equation. Sometimes the warrior would sit a bit more Defiance and use Inner Beast defensively when they didn't have home gang and vengeance. And I was a big proponent of that, was the constant Inner Beast usage to sort of remove any threat disparities from the equation and just let me have that large threat lead on the rest of the party from my Unchained. When you're in a farm setting or a speed kill setting, though, the point at which your paladin steps up to the fight is they no longer have cover, and your home gang is on cooldown as a warrior, and your vengeance is on cooldown as a warrior, because at that point you're most vulnerable. And that's when you really bring in your paladin into the equation and let their paladin make use of their sentinel, let their paladin make use of their bulwark. And that's really the only times that you cared about it. Besides that, you did want to make use of Paladin's Hallowed Ground. So what would happen is in progression, the Paladin would pull the boss and hold the boss until they roll through all their cooldowns, including their Hallowed Ground, before maybe the warrior jumps in later. And that was typically how progression kind of behaved. But a lot of teams, just for the reason of Hallowed and for the reason that DPS wasn't on their concern during progression, a lot of teams actually ended up just leaving on their Paladin. But I think that's enough of a look at Realm Reborn and sort of the dynamic and approach toward Realm Reborn tanking. I really want to get into some of the Heavensward topics, because they're honestly a lot more interesting. Yeah, tank swaps with Paladin only having Halone combo was definitely a Monka-ass situation. I agree. So the shift towards Heavensward is very, very, very exciting, because we went from this playing field of Paladin and Warrior as our only two options to tank. The DPS side of the party composition equation was always much more interesting than the tanking side, because DPS we actually had choices to what DPS we take. When it came to healers and tanks, we didn't have choices. We brought a white mage, and we brought a scholar, and we brought a paladin, and we brought a warrior. On the DPS side of things, you could choose if you wanted to run double bard, you could choose if you wanted to run double caster, if you wanted to run double monk, if you wanted to later on in 2.4, if you wanted to do the ninja monk, which was a very popular meta. Dragoons were kind of weak back then, but there was just a lot more interesting aspects because there were more DPS jobs in the equation. enter Stormblood, and Stormblood makes things so much more exciting for tanks, and it was hoped to be more exciting for healers, but unfortunately, the way it started, it really wasn't much more exciting because of the poor state of Astrologian. But obviously, what we're referencing is the inclusion of Dark Knight to the mix, and this really shook things up and shook the landscape up. We have a third tank, and we have this new kit to the equation, and it's a kit that behaves much differently. I might have meant I might have said Stormblood or Realm Reborn. I meant Heavensward if I misspoke. We're looking at Heavensward right now. We're looking at when Dark Knight was included in the mix, and what did the inclusion of Dark Knight do to tanking? The obvious is that we have a third tank to choose from, but how do we make that decision? And that's what I want to spend a few minutes talking about today. What did Dark Knight do that the other two tanks didn't? The obvious is that Dark Knight brought a lot of magic defensive capability. Back then, Paladins, we weren't able to block magic attacks. Paladin block rates and shields were physical only. We didn't even really get into the dexterity side of things for Paladin, which was a really cool topic, but in the interest of time, I'll probably skim over that. Just know that the Paladin block rate dynamic in Realm Reborn and some parts of Heavensward was much more interesting than it is now. You had varying block rates of shields and block values of shields, and you could use dexterity to increase your block rate, and it was just a much more interesting aspect towards the block mitigation of a Paladin than what we deal with today. But I'm going to have to lightly skim over that as we are entering Heavensward now. So the Dark Knight is bringing to the table a strong magic defensive kit, and how did this shake things up? Well, now we're asking ourselves when we're entering a fight, just how much magic damage is in a fight. And also Chad is actually 100% correct. They did actually change the block rates, the dex interaction with block rate in Heavensward. So that was mostly just a end of second coil and final coil thing. So it's good that we don't really need to talk about it because we're entering Heavensward now. So that's the easy transition for me. The Dark Knight the impact that the magic defense that the Dark Knight brought started prompting questions of, well, how much magic damage is in this fight? And that's definitely your first question that you ask when you're entering a new fight. Dark Knight, outside of defending against magic, defensively wasn't super strong. You have Shadow Wall, which was really just Sentinel minus. You have no access to something like a on-demand inner beast that's sort of this all-encompassing mitigation. You have a very powerful magic defense in Dark Mind and the 60-second cooldown of Dark Mind. However, that's what your niche was on the defensive side of things. That being said, as you may or may not remember if you played Heavensward, Heavensward was the beginning of the conversation of tank damage being very important to encounters, and that's because Square Enix started tuning encounters at a level that really required you to have to get the best output from all of your party members. And we started to look at more things than just defensive kits. So now that you have to make a choice between which tanks you bring to a fight, not only is the damage type argument part of the consideration, but also how much damage do the tanks do themselves? How much damage are you bringing to the party by bringing a Dark Knight? How much damage are you bringing to the party by bringing a Paladin? The unfortunate circumstance of Heavensward was that Warrior was so staple that it really was just a conversation between Paladin and Dark Knight. The fact that Storm's Path existed in the form that it did in Heavensward really made it a staple. Storm's Path was incredibly powerful, and the other two tanks didn't have anything nearly as powerful as Storm's Path. Dark Knight had what was its version of Reprisal back then, and Paladin had Rage of Cologne, which really only affected physical. It didn't really it only affected physical attacks with its strength debuff. So with Warrior being sort of a staple, you're looking at Paladin versus Dark Knight and weighing the strengths and weaknesses of those. This is, while a little bit watered down, is still a big improvement from what we saw in Realm Reborn, where we didn't even have this choice. What people end up finding is that the choice, if you're strictly looking at damage, the choice to choose a Dark Knight was more appealing because Dark Knight did out damage Paladin back then. And I think that when it came to progression, specifically low item level progression, this was a bit deceiving. And I know Vox, who is my Heavensward co-tank, he's watching in the chat. He may disagree with me on the few comments I'm about to make, but this is how I felt about Heavensward tanking and progression in Heavensward. The DPS checks, while very difficult, there was really only 1 or 2 encounters in all of Heavensward that your composition had to be a certain way. Every other encounter, you could kind of get away with taking the tank DPS out of the equation and really just focusing on what do they bring to a fight to make my party's life easier. If a fight favors physical mitigation, I myself personally was really looking at incorporating a Paladin into the mix because I want to take as much stress off of the healers as I could. So the damage differential between Paladin and Dark Knight was less of a concern for me. It's really only when you get into like an A3 Living Liquids environment where you do, and this is a great actually way to discuss how this happened. We actually did A3 progression with Paladin Warrior to start with, and it wasn't only until we started seeing Enrage that we realized, okay, mathematically this Paladin Warrior variant is not going to net a week 1 kill. It's just the damage is just not there. Only at this point do we need to start, thinking about how can we get the most out of our damage? How can we make this Enrage? And we're going to start having to sacrifice defense to do that. So let me turn down this music a little bit because it's no longer instrumental. I'm just going to lower it slightly. Okay, sorry about that, guys. Defensively, Paladin was very strong in Living Liquid. Living Liquid, Heavensward was when we saw things like Sheltron introduced to Paladin, and a very talented Paladin was able to Sheltron tank busters that didn't have cast bars by counting auto attacks, by counting their own locals. And a Paladin that was able to Sheltron the tank busters in Living Liquid without relying on a cast bar was not only very talented, but a very large boon to your team defensively. The damage mitigation they had there was very powerful, and probably even the most of all 3 tanks if they were able to successfully do it. That being said, Living Liquid was an example of a fight where you see an Enrage, you decide that your defensive tank composition cannot make it, and you start pulling punches. You start sacrificing some defense and to gain some offense. And one of the first areas people looked at was dropping a Paladin and including a Dark Knight, because the Dark Knight did out damage a Paladin. And also the Dark Knight added Delirium to the equation in the Intellect debuff, which allowed your party to shift away from Monk and adopt the Ninja Dragoon higher DPS variant, because you're losing the Dragon Kick Intellect debuff and gaining the Delirium debuff. And the Intellect debuff was very important in progression because there was a lot of AoE magic damage. So there was a bit of a dynamic and trade-off there by dropping the Paladin and bringing in the Dark Knight. There were Paladin kills, however, in order to do it at the lowest item level possible, it was nearly, I won't say it's impossible, because I do think that there was damage left on the table by all teams involved in Week 1 Gordias progression, but with current understandings of how LB back then with understandings of how LB generation worked back then, with the limited knowledge people had, it seemed mathematically impossible. So that's why the Dark Knight became more popular than the Paladin in that really low item level range. It seemed like it was the only real way to make the enrage. People weren't really used to the concepts of LB generation that may have bridged that gap. Some of the stuff that a lot of people are a lot more comfortable with now. We didn't really have that knowledge back then of how to bridge that gap and make up that damage with LB alone, which is a topic we'll, for later part of the show. The ways that you can actually make up some of the damage differentials between tanks. So, with the exception of all that, though, I lost my train of thought. The encounters that actually required that level of DPS optimization, they were few. It was really only 2 encounters throughout the entirety of Heavensward. So you could make the argument of bringing the tank that was more suited defensively to an encounter and see a strong boon from that. And that's how a lot of Heavensward progression behaved. You would encounter a fight, you'd see the damage types of the fight, and you'd make a decision. Well, for some teams, they would make a decision of, okay, this is a Paladin favored fight. Awareness is very strong in this fight. Back then, awareness was on a cross-trait, or it was cross-trait, but the awareness for Paladins had a trait to it that made it better than awareness for a Dark Knight and awareness for a Warrior. So, if a fight was heavy on crit damage, like, say, A7 or back in the days of FCOB, the Phoenix encounter, maybe you're looking at a Paladin for that encounter specifically. So it was just a cool little dynamic of balancing defense with offense, and the choices that went into choosing your tanks. That's where the conversations really went. I think as Heavensward progressed and encounters started to deal less damage, the focus on the need for your party's defensives started to wane, and you saw teams begin to favor the high DPS composition variants and put more eggs in that basket as opposed to the defensive side of things. And that's when the composition of Warrior Dark Knight really started to shine. It was really in that post-Midas entering Creator time period where Warrior Dark Knight just really started to overwhelm any Paladin variant in terms of popularity, because damage sort of started to be the primary focus of things. So I think that again, when you're thinking about the relationship between the off tank and the main tank roles in Heavensward, we haven't really even talked about the biggest change. We've sort of focused on the composition styles and differences. We haven't even gotten into some of the biggest changes that happened in Heavensward and how it changed how players approached tanking styles, and that is the addition of things like Deliverance, the addition of things that somebody can do offensively when they're not tanking the boss. I'm going to use Deliverance as an example, mostly because it's the best example. You now have this atmosphere where the decision to be tanking or off tanking largely revolves around the amount of output your off tank is dealing at the time, and because of things like Deliverance, and like Chad is alluding, the inclusion of Goring Blade and Royal Authority to a Paladin, because of those additions to the game, the off tank role is now contributing much more than the main tank role. What you're gaining by dropping tank stance and adding that Deliverance and adding those Sword Oath Goring Blades and Sword Oath Royal Authorities is a lot more than what you're gaining in Realm Reborn when you drop tank stance. And this relationship between off tanking and main tanking, and went even further than that towards the fairly early on in Heavensward, even in that main tanking outside of tank stance started to become more popular and also ideal in some situations, because what you're gaining by being outside of that tank stance was so much more than what you were gaining back in Realm Reborn. A warrior that was sitting Defiance most of the time was losing a lot compared to what a warrior who was sitting Deliverance was able to do. in Gordias, the train of thought for warriors, and this changed throughout Heavensward, but in Gordias specifically, the thought and approach for a warrior, for example, and all the other three tanks as well, but for warriors specifically, if anything hindered your ability to do a Deliverance Berserk, you avoided it. If your time needed to be in Defiance lined up with your Berserk timer, you changed your entire tanking rotation to make that not happen. You put, you made sure that if you're taking a tank buster while you're in Berserk, you made sure that you're gonna have Vengeance available, you're gonna have Raw Tuition available, you're gonna have something that allows you to stay outside of Defiance safely, because you could. Something like Berserk and Deliverance combined with your Berserk, it was such an important part of your ability to do damage that you could not negatively impact that. And you saw the same thing with Paladins. A Paladin who wants to get the most out of his fighter flights is going to be looking at dropping Shield Oath to do so. You're going to be looking at getting those fighter flighted Sword Oath Goring Blades. I don't remember if you could fit 2 Goring Blades back in Fighter Flight back then. I don't think you actually could, but I know that for sure you could fit 2 Circle of Scorns, because Circle of Scorn I think had a different cooldown back then. So your goal back then was really to get 2 Sword Oath Circle of Scorns inside your Fighter Flights. I don't think you could fit more than 1 Goring, but I might be mistaken. Well, I guess you could just drop. No, you could of course fit. You could drop a Royal Authority if necessary, but yeah, no, you could. So it was like 2 Goring Blades and 2 Circle of Scorns was the ideal. Yeah, so and you're looking at the same situation with Dark Knight, where what does a Dark Knight have offensively? Dark Knight has Blood Weapon. If at any point in the encounter you are needing to be in Grit when your Blood Weapon is coming off cooldown, this is something you want to avoid, and you started shifting CD rotations around so that when that Blood Weapon comes up, you're not forced to be in Grit, because you couldn't use it in Grit. And Dark Knight also had the blood price thing we don't really need to talk about, but it is funny to acknowledge that back in Heavensward, blood price wasn't Grit locked, so Gritless Dark Knight was actually a powerhouse, and Grit was really, I don't want to say frowned upon, but largely avoided, just because of the frequency of Blood Weapon and the fact that you could Blood Price outside of Grit anyway, so you were gaining so much MP with the combination of Blood Weapon and Blood Price outside of Grit that it was you really tried to avoid Grit. And the funny thing that ended up happening with the Dark Knight playstyles was the way that Dark Knights approached Grit in Heavensward was you really just looked at it as like a 1300 or so MP Inner Beast. It was just a form of a global. It was an Inner Beast that didn't do damage. It was a form of mitigation. Sacrifice the global, sacrifice a bit of damage to gain some quote-unquote active mitigation. Then you would immediately drop Grit as soon as the tank buster was over. That's really all Grit was, with the exception of maybe the pull. But even Gritless pulls were common in Heavensward. So Grit was very negatively viewed in Heavensward. Why is it? Why is it that tank stances? We saw less of a focus on tank stances going from Realm Reborn to Heavensward, and it really is just the power level increase of the stanceless tank. You didn't have that kind of power in Realm Reborn. The Defianceless Warrior didn't do much, and actually in some portions of the fight, because of the way stacks and Unchained work, it was a DPS loss to be outside of Defiance. A lot of times you wanted to make use of your Defiance and Unchained to build 5 stacks and do an Inner Beast, because it was your highest potency attack. As soon as they gave Warriors Felclave, that was out the window. Unchained was strictly an aggro tool, and do I need to be in Defiance for this portion? Okay, well I want Unchained here so I can not hinder my damage. That I need an Inner Beast here. Well, I'm going to save Unchained here so that while I'm using the Inner Beast, I don't get struck by the 10-second Defiance penalty. So that's really when you started to see this idea that tank stance is becoming less and less desired. It's that power spike in the stanceless tank. The tank stanceless tank, I should say. The offensive stance, the Gritless, the Sword Oath, the Deliverance. So definitely a huge shift in the way that tanks are viewed at that point. And the way you approach your cooldowning. Like I mentioned, the warrior who's in that Deliverance Berserk, they want to make sure that if necessary, they have that vengeance. Well, the funny thing about the funny thing about Berserks back in Warriors is you actually used vengeance as a wrath, as a stat gainer. So a lot of time, not vengeance, but most people use raw intuition. So you could use vengeance if you wanted to, though. And I don't want to spend too much time. I could talk for another hour about the difference between raw intuition and vengeance for warrior at that moment, because some like really seasoned warriors, they would take the raw intuition out of the berserk and they would use the vengeance inside the berserk, because the damage they're taking is magic, and you can gain your stack that way and use your raw intuition elsewhere. But that's a topic for another time. That's a warrior show topic. We'll keep it a little bit less focused on that. But yeah, so your stanceless portions of a fight dictating how you approach the fight defensively is a mindset that became popular in Heavensward, and definitely I think something that really elevated the tanking game again. Like we're seeing tanks get elevated as the game goes on in terms of ceiling and a tank's ability to impact a fight. At this point in Heavensward, my approach to tanking was still that I was a support cast of the group. Even though Deliverance Berserks were powerful, I was still not dealing the damage that true DPS classes were dealing. I was, at the end of the day, there to make sure that my DPS members of my team are doing as much damage as possible. And I think really talented Heavensward tanks all sort of thought that way. As long as we were dealing as much as we could while not hindering our party members, we were doing our job. Because really, as a tank, your job was to support your team. And my philosophy was I never wanted to put my healers in a stressful situation because of a greedy play or something they weren't prepared for. If you're gonna make a greedy play, you always give your healers a heads up. Like, gonna take a lot of damage in 5 seconds, gotta drop, gonna miss the Inner Beast on this one. Can I get an extra Advo here? Need the Berserk here, gotta drop Defiance. Can you watch me for this Tank Buster? If you gave your healers a heads up, they can react. But if you don't give them that heads up, then it's panic mode when you spike 30% more than you should have than they were expecting. So that's just how most people viewed that. So let's sort of start getting towards the end of Heavensward now and get into some more relevant topics, things that directly impact what we're dealing today. At the end of Heavensward, I sort of highlighted earlier that the damage coming from bosses was sort of lessening with every new encounter that Square Enix did. Tank stance was becoming more and more frowned upon because it wasn't necessary. A well-played tank could survive attacks with just their defensive kit and not really need to focus on their tank stance to do so. Warriors obviously had such a powerful edge over their Paladin and Dark Knight counterparts because of Unchained. A warrior could, and this is one of the other reasons that warrior was so strong in progression, because it was so flexible in this regard. A warrior could, with skilled usage of Unchained, gain access to that tank stance benefit and that Inner Beast without hindering their offensive capabilities whatsoever. You would lose your, I guess, percentage modifier from Deliverance, but it was a small price to pay for destroying that tank buster defensively. Paladin really didn't have the luxury of that. You were sacrificing damage to enter shield up. The Dark Knight was sacrificing damage to enter grid, much more so than the warrior was sacrificing. So tank stance for at least Paladin and Dark Knight became much more frowned upon, and that's the state of the game as we're leaving Heavensward and entering Stormblood. And Stormblood's going to be a fun topic to discuss because not only is it relevant to everyone watching, but also now that we've spent upwards of an hour setting the stage for it, we can really start to appreciate and understand what some of the changes in Stormblood have done to tanking. And I hope that I sort of set the stage for this properly. I know I kind of stumbled through some of those topics, and I apologize, but I definitely got everything out there that I wanted to preface before talking about Stormblood. And it really is why I made today's topic the evolution of tanking, because I feel like you can't appropriately address some of the ways that you tank in Stormblood without understanding how things have changed since then. So Thanks for bearing with me up to this point if you're still with us, and let's get into the real meat of today's show, which is Stormblood tanking. Stormblood tanking has possibly been changed the most out of the previous two launches of the game, being Realm Reborn and Heavensward. And so much of it has to do, and everyone knows this is coming. Everybody knew this was coming today. How later you're doing a show on Stormblood tanking? Is it just gonna be 2 hours of talking about Shirk? Well, it's not gonna be 2 hours of talking about Shirk, but it might be 30 minutes of talking about Shirk. No, we'll go much more beyond that. But it is true that so much of Stormblood tanking is defined by Shirk, and Shirk totally changed how you approach tanking in Stormblood versus how you approached it in Heavensward even. And let's get into why that is. We talked a little bit about earlier of how the previous way that you sort of maximized damage was, with the exception of leaving the boss on a tank that has no cooldowns, you tried to avoid tank swapping as much as possible. In a speed kill setting in Heavensward, for example, you're going to want to get the most out of your hallowed grounds. You're going to want to get the most out of home gang, which is something we haven't even had time to talk about today, the strength of home gang. We'll save that for a warrior show down the line. You want to get the most of your sentinels. You want to get the most out of your vengeances. And you want to get the most out of your living deads. You want to get the most out of your shadow walls and your dark mines. I think that because with that being the limit, the amount that you tank swapped in Realm Reborn and the amount that you tank swapped in Heavensward is much less than the amount that you should be tank swapping in Stormblood. And listen to the word that I just said, should be. And this is why I made today's show. This topic right here, guys. It took an hour for us to get here, but this is why I made today's show. This is something that I think is going to be really important to talk about for every tank that's preparing for Stormblood progression. Because if you're, and this is something that I learned myself, within the last 6 months, this is something that I've had to change in my own gameplay. I'm somebody who's been tanking since Realm Reborn, right? I have my ways of doing things since then, and I've gone through all the changes to tanks, and I've seen the different playstyles of tanks, and at certain points I've had to adjust the way I approach tanking, but never before have I had to adjust it so drastically as we do in Stormblood. Because the philosophy towards tank swapping now is a complete different topic than the philosophy of tank swapping back then. Nowadays, you need to be tank swapping as much as you can, because there's no reason not to. There's no penalty to anymore. Shirk has removed any negative connotation towards tank swapping. You don't even need to use aggro combos to tank swap anymore. The only time that you really use a threat combo to tank swap, or even a threat combo in general in a fight anymore, is is either on a pull or when you don't have Shirk, if Shirk is on cooldown. But even then, as the really experienced players who are maybe listening know, when you're doing ultimate, for example, tank swaps can be done with just smoke screens and shade walkers. You don't even need Shirks. Excuse me while I take a sip of water. Apologize. The way that I feel that Shirk should be approached in Stormblood, because you've removed any negative aspect of the tank swap, the topic of conversation is taking your two tanks together. How can we best utilize our two tanks' combinations of cooldowns? You're no longer sort of isolating yourself into a main tank or off tank role. You're no longer just looking at one tank's strengths of mitigation in this phase of the fight and the other tank's strengths of mitigation in another phase of the fight. You're looking at how can we get the most net mitigation between our two tanks throughout the entirety of the fight. And what is very common right now, and this is for a number of reasons, and we'll break down why these reasons are. What is very common for right now is the concept of super cooldowning. And what super cooldowning basically is it's pressing all of your defensive, not all of them, but overlapping cooldowns that back in the day would be seen as a misplay. Because you get diminished returns obviously with every cooldown you add. overlapping that vengeance with that thrill and that raw intuition because you don't need it elsewhere. Putting it there because what you can do is you can roll that vengeance, raw intuition, thrill. You can roll that into a home gang on the next tank buster, and then at no cost, your paladin can come in and take the boss off of you with the press of 2 buttons, a Voke and a Shirk combo. We're gonna, I think, for the purpose of today's discussion, I'm gonna shy away from the threat. I won't shy away too much from it, but the double Shirk, play that tanks will use to gain a large threat lead over the rest of their party. I'm not gonna highlight that too much today, or if any at all, just because it's not super relevant to the points of discussion we want to have today. I really want to focus on the strength of Stormblood tank swapping as a means of bettering your mitigation than anything else. And the threat thing we'll highlight as a minor point, but really I think the most important thing when it comes to progression is maximizing your defense, and doing so in a way that really has no negative connotation offensively, and that's really Shirk allows you to do that. So back to the sort of the topic at hand. The concept of super cooldowning into immunities into get the boss off of me now is very popular in Stormblood, and that's really how most tanks are playing Stormblood right now. That's how most people are doing God Kefka. That's how most people are doing UCOB. It's becoming very popular, and as it should. It's by far the best way to approach tanking in Stormblood. The more that you can leave the boss on a paladin, if you're in a speed kill setting, may be ideal because your paladin's getting access to shield swipes. But in a progression setting, it's really just about leaving it on the tank that has cooldowns, using those cooldowns, using that immunity, and then taking it off of that tank and putting it on the next tank that has cooldowns. That's just how you tank. That's definitely how you tank Savage right now. Let's use O6S as a perfect example. It's the Chatternook encounter. You can tank swap every single release, and your tanks have access to all of their cooldowns like every single time, as long as you use them properly. Specifically, the 2-minute and less cooldowns are where this style of tank swapping is most powerful. Allowing you to super cooldown one tank buster and then immunity the next, it like removes healing from the equation almost. It puts so much more power into your healer's capability to spend globals on other things, and a lot of times that other thing just ends up being more damage. But maybe in future encounters where they're either really long or damage is not a concern, maybe that allows your healer to shy back on MP and sort of rest on their GCDs. That was sort of something we saw a bit more prominently in Heavensward, in the early stages of Heavensward, when MP was like an actual real thing. Nowadays we have mana shift and just the different types of mana songs today compared to how they were back then. But the stress that it takes off of your healers when you have this super cooldown into immunity rotation is just so powerful, and it's such an easy way to approach a fight. And it's definitely what I want to preach to players who are learning tanking in Stormblood, and something that I want to definitely advise people to practice and be accustomed with as they're going into future encounters. Remember today's show was marketed towards not only people with a tanking background, but maybe people who are just either looking to get into tanking or people who want to learn more about what goes on behind the tanking scenes. This is how you should start approaching tanking as a Stormblood tank. Obviously we're just looking at 8-mans right now. We're not talking about 4-mans. It's only one tank in 4-mans. But the utilization and the introduction of Shirk has just empowered not only your tank but your entire team. Some of your DPS no longer have to worry about threat. I said I would highlight threat as a minor issue, but threat is almost removed from the equation because the threat gain that Shirk gives you is so massive. And you can do the circle Shirk method as long as you don't need your provokes elsewhere. But you can use ultimatums to do it as well. Improper usage of Shirk hurts more than just you as a tank. It hurts your whole party. And you know, people joked, like I said, going into the show, Layla, you're just going to talk about Shirk for 2 hours. No, but we're definitely going to talk about it for 30 minutes. It is so integral to the core of Stormblood tanking. It's for better or for worse. In my mind, a little bit for worse. I dislike what Shirk has done to the threat management side of things. I think that threat management is a thing of the past, unfortunately, now. And that makes me a little bit sad because I think that we should be adding on to tanking and not taking aspects of tanking away as we progress through the game. But defensively, I think it's a lot cooler than maybe the Realm Reborn and Heavensward philosophy towards tank swapping. I think tank swapping right now is while it's super powerful, it's also a way for players to work together, co-tank with co-tank, to get the most bang for your buck together at a way that's really beneficial to your team. And I think that that's very healthy for a tanking relationship. It's again moving the game away from an off-tank and main tank role, which I will always support. I will always support that. I hate the idea of an off-tank and a main tank. I have for years. So I like that aspect of Shirk. I dislike what it has done to the threat management side of things. So we'll have to see what changes they make to Shirk in 5.0. I'm anticipating that the Stormblood version of Shirk will be different than what we go forward with into 5.0. I think that it probably will remain the same for the rest of Stormblood, but it's just such a key component to Stormblood tanking, and definitely the way that you want to approach progression. I preach to any players entering progression as a tank right now. Think about how to utilize tank swaps the most effectively, and don't just leave the boss in one tank for an extended period of time. Get the most out of both your tanks. Utilize both of your tanks' cooldown sets. You don't want to be in a situation where, let me give you an example. You don't want to put yourself in a situation where you have a Warrior's Van. Let's use a Dark Knight's Shadow Wall and Dark Mind, for example. Great example right here. Shadow Wall and Rampart and Dark Mind are relatively low cooldown pieces to the Dark Knight's defensive kit. You don't want to put your Dark Knight in a position where he's unable to utilize those effectively. If you're tanking with a Dark Knight, you want to put him in a position where you're getting the most out of that Dark Mind, you're getting the most out of that Rampart. And I wonder if anybody caught earlier when I mentioned like the notion of super cooldowning, and this is completely ignoring Shake It Off because that's a warrior topic. But the notion of super cooldowning. Did you notice how I kind of didn't include Rampart into that equation? I think the example I used was like a Vengeance Thrill Raw Intuition. Honestly, it's more so Vengeance and Thrill that get paired for warriors in today's tanking meta, quote unquote. Why did I purposely leave Rampart out? And if you're doing like a God Kefir run, like a God Kefir speed kill, why would you leave Raw Intuition out? The reasoning for that is because of the fact that you're able to super cooldown tank busters so powerfully in Stormblood. It's allowing Stormblood tanks to no longer have to put their ramparts on these tank busters, or solely on these tank busters, I should say, and allowing us to make up for the fact that we're outside of tank stance so much and put them where they're best going to defend against boss autos. I can speak for myself personally. When I'm doing God Kefir right now, I'm utilizing ramparts and raw intuitions where I'm gaining the most benefit from them, i.e. where I'm defending against the longest string of boss autos that I can. I think that when it comes to raw intuition specifically, and I said I would talk about warriors not so much specifically, but it's kind of important to make this distinction. If you're doing something like that where you're putting a cooldown trying to defend against boss auto attacks, you want to, especially when it comes to something like raw intuition, you want to try to get it so that not only are you getting those strings of auto attacks, but maybe you're catching a tank buster at the end of it. maybe you're catching a Shake It Off at the end of it if it's a raw intuition. Maybe you're getting some tertiary benefit in addition to just those auto attacks from the boss. But that's what you want to be thinking about when you're thinking about Rampart usage. Rampart is powerful. It's such a long duration. Don't weaken the skill by just putting it on a tank buster alone. When things like Vengeance paired with Thrill Battle, Vengeance paired with Thrill Battle, that's plenty. If you want to be extreme, things like an Unchained Inner Beast, that's plenty for that tank buster. Try to maximize your long duration cooldowns outside of the tank busters, and Shirk empowers that. Shirk allows you to super cooldown that tank buster and not have to worry about needing Rampart for a tank buster, because as soon as that Vengeance and Thrill are down, the boss is off you anyway. The boss is on your co-tank, and they're utilizing their Sentinel, they're utilizing their Shadow Wall, they're utilizing their Hallowed, they're utilizing their Living Dead. You know, it's just empowered you and your co-tank's ability to mitigate the course of a fight, and that's like probably the most important topic I could have talked about today. And like I said, it's the purpose that I wanted to make today's show. It's what I wanted to get it to start a dialogue about. So because it's so important to how we should be approaching progression, and it's just something that every tank should be thinking about right now if they aren't already. I know to a lot of like long-standing tanks this is common knowledge, but I'm speaking to a wider audience right now. This is something that we as tanks and you as our partners should be thinking about. Yeah, I think that the outside, if we're looking at Stormblood tanking outside of Shirk, I know we've talked a lot about Shirk. I'll try to shift away from Shirk now, but it's just so important. Outside of Shirk, we've seen, I would say, how should I phrase this? We've seen changes to classes that also change the way we approach tanking. You know, the way we choose party compositions has changed, and in my opinion, personally, it's changed for the negative. We've taken Paladin and almost homogenized it in its kit. If you look at Heavensward Paladin, Heavensward Dark Knight, let's remove Heavensward Warrior from the equation just because Heavensward Warrior was stupid. We can all agree that it was stupid. Let's take Heavensward Paladin and Heavensward Dark Knight. Both of those jobs specialized in different areas of a fight. Fast forward now to Stormblood, where Paladin is just a jack of all trades. I can block magic, lol. They've removed like a big portion of the argument for bringing a Dark Knight. They've lessened and dampened Dark Knight's niche in an encounter. And I think that's not good. I know we're going to be seeing some Dark Knight changes come 4.3. One of the things I want us to look for is, are they going to address that at all? Are they going to address the fact that we've made Paladin this sort of jack of all trades, but left Dark Knight in this specialized role? And this is something I want to shout out Vox and Rafter specifically. I met with them a couple weeks ago at this point. Both the, if you're not aware, Vox and Rafter are the two tanks for previously Angered, now Entropy. I had a great discussion with them a couple weeks ago about the state of Dark Knight, and one of the things that I took away from that meeting and was just reminded about is just how specialized Dark Knight remains compared to its Paladin and Warrior counterparts. Dark Knight's niche right now is still a magic tank. We've gained TBN as a Dark Knight, and TBN is a fantastic addition to Dark Knight. Don't get me wrong. Self TBN is what's keeping Dark Knight afloat right now, I'll be honest. Self TBN is very powerful, and its low cooldown is very powerful. But because of the fact that it still does a little bit less damage than Paladin universally, and Paladin brings so much raid utility, its niche really is still that 60-second Dark Mind. If you can take full advantage of the 60-second Dark Mind, Dark Knight stock raises astronomically. But that's the specialized role, and we've homogenized Paladin and Warrior. Are we going to homogenize Dark Knight as well and make it less of a specialized role? That's what I want to see. I don't want to say that's what I want to see change. That's what I'm curious to see if they address come 4.3. That's like probably the primary thing that I want to see if they address. And I hope that it's not just we made Dark Knight deal more damage so that the argument for bringing a Dark Knight is no longer just a magic specialty, but it's also a damage specialty. I hope that that's not the direction they take. I hope that they address the kit more so than the damage. And I think that would make for a much more interesting dynamic, personally. Yeah, so I'll be really interested to see what happens there. I think that we've gone a little bit longer than I anticipated today to talk about all this stuff, and I apologize for that. I'm still getting this is my second time doing this. I'm still getting used to sort of not dwelling on topics for too long. So I want to move on to sort of the final portion of our show today, where it's going to be a time for questions, and I just want to wrap things up here when it comes to Stormblood tanking. Some other things to highlight if you're looking to approach progression tanking in Stormblood, and I could have a whole show on progression tanking, and maybe I will in the future, but if you're looking into getting into Stormblood tanking, there are a few things that you should consider. The power of Shirk is first and foremost. The choice you make in which tanks you bring is second, I think. Definitely think critically about what tanks you bring. Don't just look at the top FF logs parsers and the top FF logs speed kills, and think critically about why that group chose what they did. What are they gaining by bringing Paladin Warrior? What are they gaining by what did the world first team of UCOB gain by bringing Dark Knight and Paladin? Even though he went on record saying that he just brought Dark Knight to it because he enjoyed Dark Knight more, think about it beyond that. Think about it critically. He may have enjoyed Dark Knight more, but what did they gain? Well, what if you think about it, what they gained was an extremely trivialized set of Akmorns. Dark Knight smothers Akmorn. You lose some power against Mornifah, but you gain power against Akmorn. So think critically about the trade-offs that you gain by swapping a tank, and do also consider the damage differential. That being said, as item levels increase and as damage of our DPS counterparts get higher and higher, we are sort of seeing the tank DPS differentials become less and less of an issue, less and less of a concern. I don't think we're quite there yet, but we're as close to being there as we ever have been. The difference between tank DPS actually mattering. Right now, Warrior trumps Paladin and Dark Knight damage. In most scenarios, it's a little bit less so of an argument in progression, but in a speed kill setting, it's really hard to argue against bringing a Warrior. Not only for the fact that Warrior is out damaging its two counterparts, but also the stupid LB generation you can do is shake it off. It's just obnoxious compared to what its counterparts can do. But I digress. Think about what you're gaining by bringing in a certain tank to a fight. Think about the impact that your Shirk usages have on the fight. Think about the impact of your other cross rolls. The cross roll system was changed drastically in Stormblood compared to the two previous iterations of the game. I don't know if I should talk about this because it might drag on for too long, but I'll give you an example. Excuse me. Sorry for the long pause. I'll give you an example of one area where cross rolls can be a very important discussion topic. Ultimatum. It's probably one of the most infrequently used cross rolls in the game right now. However, sometimes one of the best assets to your cross rolls in progression. How many times have you gone through an encounter and wiped just because you don't have a provoke? Adding the ability to have a second provoke to your team, or second provoke to your tank, can save a pull. Is it going to have more or less impact than awareness or convalescence on your pull? I leave that for you guys to decide. It's an encounter by encounter discussion that you should have with yourself and maybe your co-tank. But think about your cross rolls. They go beyond just Shirk. They do actually matter, and I think that that's probably everything that I want to highlight in a show today for Stormblood. If I missed anything else that you guys want me to discuss with you guys, or maybe think about myself. I'm gonna leave that up to you guys to prompt in our question time that we're gonna be shifting into now. If you're unfamiliar, this is only the second show we've done. So what I like to do at the end of my show, my podcast, is gonna be time for questions, and we've been collecting questions throughout the show. I'm gonna look at ones that maybe make for good discussion topics. And if I missed anything that maybe you want to discuss more, definitely add it to the discussion. I'm going to link the question form where you can add questions in chat. So feel free to add anything that you might want to hear more about. But yeah, I think at this point I'm going to shift into questions, guys. We're about an hour and 25 into the show. I really appreciate you guys sticking it out with me. It's been a lot of fun. I've just been sitting here talking, nerding out in front of you guys and bearing it all. So, yeah, I see people in chat asking for an answer to the TBN question. I don't see the TBN question immediately in front of me, so please just re-ask me, and I'll definitely answer it. I'm going to be looking at some of the questions submitted to the forum right now. I already picked out a few of them earlier that I think would be really good. One of the ones that jumped right out of me is they ask, before Stormblood came out, YoshiP mentioned how tank damage was too high and removed the vitality scaling. Do you think tank damage is too high? What about the removal of vitality scaling? So this sort of ties into a topic that we discussed earlier in the show about the. I guess actually I didn't get to discuss this, so I guess now's a good time. Yeah, the strength meta that we did highlight earlier, that changed in the second half of Heavensward when they removed tank's ability to scale off of strength for a while, and tanks scaled off of fending, so it did sort of remove that fun little dynamic that tanks danced with. And then before Stormblood came out, they removed the scaling off of vitality, and just actually I think it actually underwent a second change at some point. I think at one point it was scaling off of vitality and strength, but I could be mistaken. It's been so long, guys. But somebody in chat can correct me if that's wrong. But I think at one point there was a point where it scaled off of. Well, I know it does now, but I guess I'm talking about like a 1-to-1 ratio. I can't remember. But anyway, to answer your question, do I think that tank damage was too high? I think that tank damage was too high at little cost. I don't think the tank damage was too high per se, just in general, but I think at too little of a cost it was. I am somebody who liked the old school dynamic of sacrificing HP to boost my damage, so I'm obviously going to be a little bit biased towards that. I thought it was a fun balancing act for tanks to play. But yeah, so I guess that would be my response to that. Honestly, though, you'd like to see more fights like the new X-Type in terms of a ton of enemy resets to take advantage of Shirks. This isn't a question from the forums, this is a question from the chat. I think that if they're going to continue the Shirk pathway, enemy resets are a way to... Really all an enemy reset does is it forces you to have a Shirk there. I don't think it actually makes things very interesting. I think enemy resets aren't super interesting. I don't know. I'm struggling to answer this because I'm arguing with myself in my head right now. Well, I don't think enemy resets are super interesting because of Shirk's existence. I think also that because of Shirk's existence, not having an enemy reset and just having a super large threat lead for the entirety of the encounter and having it never be threatened, I think that's even worse. So in the current state of things, I think enemy resets are a necessary evil. In the old state of things, what I liked about the old state of things, the pre-Shirk threat management, was that in order to maximize your damage, you were slowly losing threat over time and you would eventually reach a point in the fight where your DPS caught back up to you. That doesn't exist anymore. So you would just, if you don't have resets, you would just have like this threat lead that lasts for the entirety of the fight, and it would never be threatened. And it's a necessary evil right now, unfortunately. Here's an interesting question, one that I may not be able to answer with good justice, but I'll give it a shot. From a healer main's perspective, do you think tanks and healers evolve together at the same rate, or one is ahead of the other? From a 2.x perspective of now, it's drastically different how those roles play now, as 2.x was a pace of everyone figuring things out. 3.x where high DPS meta evolved, and healers/tanks mitigated everything to know where it's a team effort to mitigate. So I think that I've gone on record multiple times, and I will state it again, that the most important member of a team, and I don't mean this to be in contradiction to anything I've said today, but I just consider this like an addition to anything I've said today. The healer has the most impact on whether or not you are successful in an encounter. Tanking has a high impact, but healing is the most important role in the game. And I think that tanking is more limited by what Square Enix confines us with in terms of class kits and class limitations than healing is. I think tanking is a little bit more limited than healing, and because of that, healing has been able to evolve. Healers' playstyles have been able to evolve at a more accelerated rate than tanking has over the years. Now, that doesn't mean that healers have like evolved their healing methods more over the years, because honestly what's happened is, as healers get better and as tanks get better, healers heal less, and you're more so focused on mitigating things than healing reactively to things. You're mitigating something and then topping before the next mechanic preemptively. It's less so a game of reactions and more a game of prevention. And I think that playstyle has been nurtured and evolved more so than what maybe the tanking has evolved drastically. Don't get me wrong. We just had a whole hour and a half show about how tanking has evolved. That's the name of the episode. But the healing playstyle and approach to healing has evolved with every patch. And I don't know if we can say that tanking has evolved with every patch. Voxfall in the chat saying, we talked a bit about the past, but which direction would you like to see tanking go in the future? More mitigation focus like WoW's active mitigation, or something else entirely? That's a really fun topic. So I am somebody who does play both MMOs, as people may or may not know. WoW is a game heavily centered on active mitigation, and Warrior 14. Final Fantasy is a game that focuses more on prepared prevention rather than active in the moment mitigation. You know, Inner Beast is the closest thing that we have to, and actually Sheltron is the closest thing we have to active mitigation. But so much of a rotation is defined not really around the Sheltron does help a paladin's rotation and alleviate and bolster a paladin's rotation, but what defines a paladin rotation is like where you're putting your sentinel and where you're putting your hallowed ground. I take like a brewmaster monk, for example, in World of Warcraft. I did mythic kill Jaden without even needing to press fortifying brew, because so much of my mitigation as a brewmaster is done through active mitigation, through purifies, and through managing my stagger. My longer cooldowns and my preemptive cooldowns, they don't matter really that much. I mean, they're powerful, don't get me wrong, but when you compare them to the relative strengths and impact in Final Fantasy, it's less so. So I actually I'm a fan of WoW tanking, and I've been a fan of Final Fantasy tanking. Obviously, I've done it for over 4 years. I would like to see more things similar to Sheltron within reason. I think that Final Fantasy's big drawback right now is that so many things are server tick based that it's very difficult to to do things reactionary in this game. So maybe things like Sheltron, but with a leeway. Like maybe make a Sheltron that says blocks special attacks or something, excludes auto attacks, something like that. In addition to that, I want to also shift my answer to a different pathway. Ultimate Weapon has been a big topic of late, and as such, I'm sure most teams out there preparing for Ultimate, and I'm sure Vox, your team as well, a lot of us have gone back to the Realm Reborn primals and Ultimate Weapon himself to relearn the fights and analyze them. And one thing that you'll notice from a lot of the Realm Reborn encounters is, at least the one thing that I was reminded of that I had forgotten about, honestly, is just how few tank busters are actually tied to cast bars back then. I remember, and we talked a little bit about Living Liquid earlier, the sign of a god paladin in Gordias tanking was, are you a paladin who can Sheltron the fluid, oh god, I'm blanking on the name of the skill. The fluid swipes. What were they called? I can't remember. Oh, my dog has to use the restroom. I'm gonna wrap up in a few minutes, guys. But I can't remember the name of the tank buster from Living Liquid. The swipes that he does, it stacks up to 4. Anyway, the sign of a good paladin back then was you were able to anticipate that attack coming because you were counting the boss's autos and you were counting your GCDs and you would time the Sheltron perfectly. But it was great. It was just such a high skill gap, honestly. I think if you want to test your merit as a tank in this game, as a reactionary tank in this game, go min-eye level. Don't min-eye level. Go a little bit lower than min-eye level. A3 Savage as a paladin, and Sheltron his tank busters. So much today are we spoiled by cast bars that one of the this would have been a great topic for today, so thank you for bringing it up, Fox. One of the things that we've lost over the years is a skill that was very popular in Realm Reborn and Heavensward tanking, and the counting of globals, the counting of boss auto attacks, because we play a game that is very scripted. Let's all admit it. Final Fantasy is super scripted. And at least in the old days, even in its scripted nature, you could a very talented player could take advantage of its scripted nature and find a skill gap in it. Being able to count the boss's autos while you're tanking, while you're positioning, so that you know that you don't miss that inner beat, so that you know that you don't miss that Sheltron. These days in Stormblood, we don't really have that interaction anymore. Everything seems to be tied to a cast bar lately. And so my long roundabout answer to your question is, I would like us to maybe experiment with some cast barless tank busters again, going forward in tanking. I think cast bar tank busters are necessary, but make us work for our mitigation as tanks. Make us really have to try hard to mitigate, and maybe buff Sheltron to deal with the fact that unless you're a god, it's kind of difficult to deal with server ticks sometimes. Maybe do the recommendation that we added earlier that maybe you remove auto attacks from being able to be blocked by Sheltron, just stuff like that. That's how I would answer. That question. I've got to start wrapping up here pretty quickly, guys, because we're going a little bit over our time limit that I wanted to set for today. But I've really enjoyed today's show, and it's something that I could talk about for hours, unfortunately, or beneficial, or fortunately. I'm going to take one last question here, and there's a ton of questions here. I apologize. I think what I'll do, because in the interest of time today, I think questions that I haven't gotten today, because I see like 4 good ones on my screen right now that I could spend 20 minutes talking about. Check Twitter over the next couple hours, guys. I'm going to be answering some of these on Twitter. Some of the ones that we weren't able to highlight in the time we have today, because there's a lot of great ones. The one that we're going to wrap up today here with is one that sort of just jumped out at me. What is your opinion on ultimate cooldowns like Living Dead, Hollowed, and Home Gang? I feel like with proper usage, they trivialize a lot of tank damage in the game. Especially with Home Gang having only a 3-minute cooldown, it can be used 3 times in a single fight and removes any danger of tanks dying to busters. I feel like this is a great question because it sort of builds off of one of our topics of today, of that notion of the power of Shirk and the power of super cooldowning in Stormblood. And you're exactly correct that immunities are more powerful than they've ever been, particularly because of not only Warrior's state of the game, but because we're just rotating immunities and super cooldowns. Maximizing the number of immunities you get in an encounter is very important. Let's use God Kepka as an example. Early progression kills with God Kepka, we didn't really see maximized home gang usages out of teams. Some teams we did, but majority of high-ranking teams, the immunities were not totally maximized. I think the Paladin Dark Knight variants were a little bit easier to maximize because you hollowed here and you Living Dead there at the end. The home gang ones were a little bit more, not difficult, but they were a little bit more intricate. In that, probably the best way to utilize home gang in God Kepka right now, at least in my opinion personally, is the triple home gang, where you're home ganging the early Ultimate Embrace and home ganging the 2 sets of towers Ultimate Embraces to remove 3 Ultimate Embrace tank busters from the fight entirely. And one thing I'll even add, I'll make your question even broader. One of the things you could even add into your question is cover. Cover is obviously Paladin centric, or Paladin specific, but it's again something that you should be utilizing as much as you can in progression. The fact that we've been given a trait in Stormblood to make cover even better than it already was, and was already good, means that we should be incorporating that into our cooldown rotation as well. And it just can't be understated how powerful abilities like cover and abilities like immunities are. So thank you for asking that question and sort of highlighting that again. The fact that home gang is 3 minutes is a little absurd, but save that for a Warrior show. I think with that, guys, I'm going to be wrapping up here. I really had fun with this show. Like I said, it's something I could talk about for hours, but I don't want to make the show go on too long. I try to keep these under 2 hours, and I actually thought this was going to be under an hour and 15 today, but we've already gone up for an hour and 45. But I hope you guys enjoyed it. Sorry I didn't get to follow along with the chat as much as I'd like to, but there was, like I said, there's just so much to cover today. So maybe in the future I'll try to cover a little bit less in the show and try to get more of the interaction with you guys in the chat as we go along. But as always, I really appreciate you guys showing up today. We saw a ton of familiar names in the chat again today, just like we did last week. Podcasting has been something that I've admired and always had a hidden passion for that I've never been able to delve into. So I hope that it's an enjoyable show for you guys and that it's offering something worth listening to. And as always, criticisms, please leave them, positive and negative. I just want to make the show as better as I can and as enjoyable for you guys as it can be. That feel when Layla thinks he can talk about tanks for less than an hour and a half. I know, man, I know. So once again, we're going to wrap up today. And with that, guys, it's time for you all to get out of here. I'm done with you. Get out. It's been a blast, guys. Thank you for finishing off today's official first episode of Crit the Bootshine. This is a bi-weekly show, remember, so the next show will be not next Thursday, but the Thursday after next Thursday. And I believe the show topic for the next show will primarily be focused on the patch expectations, and we'll have learned a little bit more about the patch before we arrive there, because we're going to have the second live letter. And hopefully by then I'll have a working sound card, so I don't have to deal with these crappy mic qualities. And I think the background noise and stuff was a little bit less, and the audio levels were a little bit better than today's show, so that's good. Please, if you enjoyed today's show, I'll see you again on May 17th, and it should be a lot of fun to do that show as well. So thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next time.